Yoga means union. The word itself comes from the same English word as yoke, and that means to unite or to bind, as in an ox being yoked to the cart. Note that the word religion also means to bind. Yoga is a spirituality for knowing the self and expanding consciousness. It's basically a disciplined-based approach to enlightenment. In modern yoga classes, asana is heavily emphasized, but originally, yoga was more focused on meditation and consciousness. Yoga was first mentioned in the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedic texts. And it was slowly defined and developed over the last few thousands of years, including through the Upanishads and during the Vedic period in the Bhagavad Gita. And then yoga was, and the practice or philosophy of yoga was systematized, expounded, and organized by Patanjali in the 2nd century BC. And that was organized in a text called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which remains, by and large, a defining text. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, yoga began to make its way into the West, starting with the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, when Swami Vivekananda presented some of the principles of yoga. And there was also talk about how he calmed the ocean storm, saving the ship on his journey here. And that always has overtones of Jesus calming the waters in the gospel text, which I find interesting. Patanjali defines yoga as the stilling of the mind, or the removal of mental fluctuations. You may have heard one of the sutras of yoga, Yogas Chitta Vriddhi Nirodha, which is basically talking about stilling the mind. The idea is that when fluctuations in the mind cease, only eternal truth remains. Basically, the person transcends all that is temporal. This is the essential aim of Asian philosophy, is getting at something that is true, eternal, and unchanging. You may recognize this from our discussions on Sankhya, that the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali would talk about freedom from desire and self-fulfillment. Here you see a quote there. And that how movement and change will cease. In this way, the purpose of change is accomplished, and all change in the physical realm comes to an end. It's one of the sutras there. So Patanjali says that mastery over the mind and the senses leads to perfect perception of reality. Here's some quotes on transcendence. Meditating on unimaginable external thought waves gives rise to maximum disembodiment, which lifts the veil in the true self. And that liberation fulfills the goal of the true self, Purusha. And matter, or Prakriti, or Guna, is transcended. And then, thus, the true nature of being and absolute knowledge are revealed. So how does one achieve this transcendent, which is similar to Sankhya? Patanjali outlines an 8-step process to achieve enlightenment, to achieve the goal of transcendence. They include the 5 restraints, the 5 observances. So 5 things you shouldn't do, 5 things you should. Then postures. Notice step 3 there is what you see in most yoga classes. And all you get is step 3. Although each of these steps are in yoga classes. Control the breath appears in many classes, breathing with the pose, etc. Focus and concentration and holding the mind, you see that a lot. Meditation, you see that a lot. And so each of the 8 steps are present in every yoga class, but to a person who's just walking in off the door, what they're going to notice is mostly the postures, or the the different yoga poses, And then the other 8 steps are a little more subtle, depending upon the teacher. Basically, the idea is you follow each of these steps, right? First, after you do the postures and control the breath, then you withdraw your senses, you concentrate the mind, you meditate, and then you get to samadhi. And the result is total and complete mastery over the self. That's what Patanjali's goal is, total mastery over yourself and complete transcendence. The sutras also talk about siddhis, they're called, or supernatural powers that are gained through meditation and yoga practices, including things like meditation, like levitation. Here you see an example of a boy levitating during his practice. I think that story of Vivekananda calming the storm is an example of a siddhi. And even my teacher, Dr. Lad, used to say that gems would appear in his hand during meditation. Patanjali, here's a quote from Patanjali. Supernatural powers arise from birth, drugs, mantras, austerity, or yoga and samadhi. He talks about how a person can attain omniscience through the practice of yoga. And, I think that idea of pursuing enlightenment is, in some sense, pursuit of that. But he says here, mastery of this meditation gives rise to absolute knowledge of all that can be perceived, including past lives, position of the stars, etc. He talks about a siddhi of perfection, a siddhi where you get the strength of an elephant, where you can become invisible, where you can become very small. And here's another one, which, always gives me the chills. He says that relinquishing the cause of attachment to the physical realm and gaining knowledge of the energy channels gives you the ability to enter into another person's body. And I've always, that always seems a little chilling to me, and I've always hoped that nobody enters me. Anyway, there are several different types of yoga. So that's basically what yoga is. The 8 limbs, including those the asanas and control the breath, etc., and then the meditation and the enlightenment and the siddhis that come from it. And then, so what are some of the modern types of yoga and some not so modern types of yoga? Well, Ashtanga yoga is the school of yoga started by Patanjali, and Ashtanga literally means 8-limbed. Anga means limb, Ashta means 8. And modern day Ashtanga yoga was created by Pattabhi Jois, and it involves synchronizing the breath with flowing movements that produce heat. And the practice was originally designed for adolescent boys. Raja Yoga means royal path, and it's another name for Ashtanga. Hatha Yoga, Hatha means force, and Hatha Yoga typically involves physical postures and breathing techniques practiced more slowly and methodically. So instead of the flow style that we just spoke about with Ashtanga. And Hatha developed around 11th century CE. And later classical texts of Hatha Yoga, such as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, came around 15th century. So here's an alternative translation. Instead of Hatha meaning force, here's one that says Hatha means sun and moon. Yoga means to join, and Pradipika means to enlighten or illuminate. And Hatha Yoga Pradipika was written by Nath Yogi Svatmarama. And that's one of the most influential texts. Then there's Karma Yoga, which doesn't involve asana, but acts of selfless service. And that was outlined in the Bhagavad Gita. There's Jnana Yoga, which Jnana means knowledge. And that's specifically knowledge of Brahman and Atman. Atman is the universal soul, Brahman is God, and the realization of their unity is described in the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita. Then there's Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti means love or devotion. And this was the use of devotion to reach spiritual enlightenment. And it was kind of a reaction to the more ascetic approach to self-realization. Right? Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are very austere, whereas Bhakti Yoga is about love, devotion, and they focus their mind, emotions, and senses on the divine in order to merge into divine love. So we have to wonder what divine love means. Brahma is nirguna or has no attributes. So does Bhakti Yoga, does it follow the same idea of Brahma? Because it seems here that they're saying that love is an attribute of the divine, as opposed to God being nirguna. So, yeah. So Bhakti Yoga is basically the cultivation of unconditional love. What are the texts? Bhagavata Purana is also a Sanskrit text promoting devotion or bhakti to Krishna. So here's, so in this case, devoting to a specific one of the Hindu gods. And this text, the Bhagavata Purana, is sometimes referred to as the fifth Veda. It was around 8th or 10th century AD. So not during the Vedic period. Much later. Yoga and Ayurveda grew up side by side with each other, and so there's in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and other texts you see references to pacifying the doshas and other Ayurvedic concepts. Here in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, it says the aim of yoga is to attain liberation, but you can only do that with a healthy body, right? You can only achieve the spiritual goal if you're healthy, or maybe it says that you can just, if you're healthy, it's easier. So both yoga and Ayurveda have practices of purification. So there's lots of cleansing among the serious yoga crowd, and that's also true for Ayurveda. Ayurveda cleansing is tempered with some more nurturing practices as well. So you have the Shat Karma in yoga, and you have the Pancha Karma in Ayurveda. Ayurveda and yoga today are frequently practiced alongside each other. They're often called sister sciences. Yoga may be used to support the musculoskeletal body. Ayurveda is used to support the organs. So together you can support your muscles, bones, and organs. Yoga offers a spiritual and musculoskeletal model for mental health, right? Relieving tension, balancing the mind, stilling the mind, where Ayurveda treats mental health by balancing the blood and the nervous system. Ayurveda can be used to classify yoga poses according to dosha, guna, etc. So there's can be some overlap between them. But there's some differences too. Ayurveda is more body-centric. Yoga is more focused on transcending the body and getting liberation from the body, but Ayurveda is more focused on the health of the body itself. So people who go to yoga classes think that yoga is for their body, and pretty much in the early stages it is. But as you go deeper, the more deeply you go into yoga, the more you realize it's an ascetic practice to transcend or minimize the body.